Hello, welcome to Biology 113. I'm your instructor, Mrs. Weir. I'm excited to use this new technology. I hope you enjoy my video today. I'm going to be talking Chapter 1. This first video is only going to cover Chapter 1, Section 1, specifically properties of living things. So let's get started. I'm going to move myself to the corner here. Okay, so I'm out of the way. Now let's get started. First of all, what is biology? Well, you might already know that biology is the scientific study of life or of living things. In order for something to be alive, we actually have a list of properties that you have to satisfy in order to be considered alive. So biologists have come up with this list, and they consider something to be a living thing only if it displays all of the following properties that we'll talk about. First, living things are made of cells. There is no other way around this one. Again, it's not negotiable. The cell is the most basic, most fundamental unit of life. All living things are made up of one or more cells. Some living things, like bacteria and yeast, they're only one cell big, so their entire body, so to speak, is just that one cell. Here's a picture, by the way. This is a picture of a single cell. This is a typical animal cell right here, but this is one individual cell that's been magnified 13,000 times. And so if something is only one cell big, we call it unicellular. If something is more than one cell big, like this elephant, we call it multicellular. So organisms can be either trillions of cells big, or they can be just one cell big. Regardless, this is the very first thing that you have to satisfy in order to be considered a living thing. You got to be made up of one or more cells. Living things also reproduce, and over time they grow and develop. Well, what do we mean by reproduction? What do we mean when we say that they reproduce? Well, there's this adage that life begats life, or life gives rise to life. Living things come from other living things. And part of Mother Nature's way is that living things make more of specifically their own kind. So it's no surprise to you probably that when an elephant reproduces, it makes more baby elephants. In other words, elephants don't give rise to lions. Elephants don't give rise to banana trees. Living things make more of their own kind. Now, there is different types of reproduction. If we compare sexual reproduction versus asexual reproduction, sexual reproduction requires two parents to produce a new offspring. This is where you usually have sexes like males versus females, or in some cases, they're just opposites. Asexual reproduction, this A right here at the front of the word, it's a negator. Another means without or not sexual reproduction. Asexual reproduction only requires one parent, doesn't require two. This is very common in multicellular organisms such as bacteria and yeast. You don't have to have two bacteria to make a third bacteria. One bacteria can divide itself in half, and now where you only had one, you can have two. In fact, our good friend E. coli, it can divide under certain conditions about every 20 minutes, as long as it's well fed, it's healthy, and things are just right. Another form of asexual reproduction, which we'll talk a lot about later in the semester, is mitosis. Mitosis occurs in mitosis occurs in multicellular organisms. When you think of you and I, we undergo really this form of asexual reproduction, but not necessarily to give rise to more people. Instead, we use it to replace old cells. Since you and I are made up of trillions of cells, some of our cells get old and have to be replaced over time. A good example are like skin cells or blood cells. They don't last forever, and they have to be replaced. So we kind of undergo this, in a sense, an internal asexual reproduction, where we are giving rise to more of our own type of cells, but not necessarily to a new type of organism. Just something kind of think about, different types of reproduction. We also say that living things grow and develop. Now, growth and development It occurs because you have information in your genes, deep in your DNA. And those genes, they control the pattern of growth and change in all organisms. When we think of growth and development, these are connected, but they're not exactly the same thing. When something grows in size, it's getting physically larger. A lot of times, but not always, growth means that you have more cells. In the case of bacteria, bacteria can grow to some extent. In other words, you have a small cell that gets a little bit bigger, but it doesn't grow much, not a whole lot. And since bacteria are only one cell big anyway, they don't actually have an increase in the number of cells. So it's just them, they get a little bit bigger. The same thing for some of the cells that when we reproduce internally, some of our new cells, when they come into existence, they have to get a little bit bigger before they can actually grow. Oh, let's see. I'm not making any sense on that one. Let me say this about growth. Multicellular organisms, like you and I, when we grow in size, when we get physically bigger, often we have to have more cells. In fact, always we have to have more cells. Makes sense, right? The bigger the animal, the bigger the plant, the more cells they have. Development is a little bit different from physical growth. Development really refers to a maturation process. It's often controlled by hormones. And so a good example would be, think of, let's say, a dog. When a dog is very young, like a puppy, there are certain things that a dog cannot do when it is a puppy. A puppy cannot get pregnant and create more puppies. It's not mature enough to do that. Depending how old that puppy is, it may not even have his eyes open. In fact, puppies are born with their eyes sealed closed because their eyes are not fully developed, not yet. It takes time, not very long, for those eyes to open. When puppies first learn to walk, they're kind of clumsy, they're not very strong. It's because their muscles are still developing. By the time a puppy is a year old, we would fully expect that dog to be able to walk around on its own, for its eyes to be fully developed, and that a dog of that age could give rise to other dogs. That's a good example of development. Often growth and development go together. Not only does your puppy get physically bigger, but it also matures to where it can do things that it didn't do before. Living things, they also use energy. And what we mean by energy use, it's more than just taking in food. They take in some sort of nourishment or some form of energy and then convert it to something else. Often we think of energy use like metabolism, and you can really use those words interchangeably. Metabolism, it's defined as all the chemical reactions that occur inside of a living thing. Well, in order for an organism to take in energy, certainly to convert that energy and to expel some of that energy, that's going to involve a lot of chemical reactions. There's two sets of chemical reactions that we can classify inside this metabolism, or these metabolic processes. Those chemical reactions where tear molecules apart, and those which take what we've torn apart and use them to build new parts. A good example, think about when you eat, you take in food, you know that your digestive system takes your food and breaks it into the smallest, most fundamental chemicals that it can. And then it uses those food particles in order to rebuild things like hair and other proteins that you need, parts of your skin, even mucus. All of those building materials come from basically the food in your diet that you've recycled in order to build the things that you need. There's different ways that organisms can undergo metabolism, or different ways that they can use energy. Some common ways: photosynthesis. Of course, we think of plants when we hear photosynthesis. This might be a new word for some of you: chemosynthesis. This is a unique way that bacteria can undergo energy use. Aerobic respiration, we see that also a lot in living things. And of course, fermentation. These are all different examples of types of metabolism or ways that organisms can use energy. One thing to think about when we talk about energy use, it's real easy to focus on what you take in and you can see the effort of expelling energy. But another way that you can tell that an organism is undergoing metabolism is by its waste products. The most common waste product, believe it or not, is heat. So when an organism gives off heat, you can consider that to be a waste produced by metabolism. Other examples of waste could be, of course, carbon dioxide. In the case of photosynthesis, one of the waste products might surprise you in case you didn't know, but a waste product of photosynthesis is actually oxygen. Water, which is a waste product of photosynthesis and aerobic respiration, you can also, when an organism gives off water, you can also consider that to be evidence that the organism is undergoing metabolism or it's undergoing some sort of an energy use. Living things are put together in a very particular way. You know, their body parts are nicely designed. They have a nice, complex, gorgeous structure about them. So we say that living things, they exhibit order about them, that the way that they are put together isn't kind of a haphazard thing, that every part is in its place and every part has a particular job. Even if we don't always know what that part does, at least not fully, every part has a reason for being there, and it's put together in just the right place so that it can do its job perfectly. Living things, we also say that they exhibit irritability. In other words, they can respond to changes in the environment. This is a very important property of living things. Sometimes it's hard for us to tell something is undergoing metabolism, like a plant, for example. You know, they seem to just kind of sit there on the desk. But you can tell if something is responding to changes in the environment. How often do we see plants that their leaves begin to droop after a few days without any water? Lack of water is certainly something that could be a change in the environment of that plant, and its drooping leaves could be a response. In the case of animals, you know, our body temperatures have to be tightly controlled. And if we get too hot, we need to find ways to cool ourselves off, either by perspiring or using what's readily available to us in the environment to help cool us off. The reason irritability is so important is because we have inside of us a very narrow limit of what we can tolerate. In other words, we have this internal environment, and irritability, or the ability to respond to change, the whole point of it is to help you maintain what's called your homeostasis. In other words, these narrow limits of your internal environment, they have to be maintained. If you get too far outside of these narrow limits, you don't feel well, your health suffers. And so we say that your homeostasis is the process of staying inside of those narrow limits, whatever they are. Again, a good example is body temperature. In humans, average body temperature is about 98.6 degrees Celsius. That's equivalent to 37 degrees Celsius. I think I said that wrong. 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, which is equal to 37 degrees Celsius. In any case, that's the average body temperature for people. We can tolerate our body temperature going a little bit higher or a little bit lower, but we don't always feel good. It is our body's natural response, if we get too cold, to try and return us to that narrow limit of what we can tolerate. So if our body temperature begins to drop, we might do some things. We might exhibit irritability, which will cause us to generate heat. Shivering, for example, is a response to an extreme loss of heat and trying to generate that heat back. The opposite of that, if our body temperature gets too high, let's say it climbs to 100, 101, 102, we might even perspire in order to help bring our temperature back down to that particular narrow limit. If you go too high outside of that narrow limit, or too far below that narrow limit, and you stay out there for too long, you may not recover. Or if you do recover, you're not exactly the same that you were before. Again, thinking about body temperature. If your temperature goes to 102, 103, 104, and it stays that high for an extended period of time, you can actually suffer brain damage. That's why fevers are so dangerous and of concern for parents all of the time when they're little babies or little children. They get a high body temperature. Living things, they don't stay the same. Living things, they change. And in biology, we use the word evolution to specifically describe how living things change with regard to their genetic information. Evolution, it's a process where individuals with traits are able to better survive and pass on those genes to their offspring. And it's that differential survival, that differential reproduction, which drives the process of change. So we know that our modern day elephants and our woolly mammoths, they are related in the sense that they share a common ancestor. We don't say that elephants and woolly mammoths are the same organism, simply that they have a common ancestor that they both descended from. We can actually measure that by looking at the genes that they have in common and looking at the genes that they have differently. So now that we've kind of talked about the characteristics of living things, let's think about this. Are viruses considered to be living things? Well, viruses, they're tricky. So if we use the criteria that we just learned, those processes, and we apply them to whether or not a virus is alive, what would we decide? Now we need a little bit more information, and so I'm going to give you these two little nuggets here. First of all, a virus is not composed of cells. Secondly, a virus cannot reproduce on its own. So with these two nuggets of information, what do you think the answer is to the question, would you consider a virus alive? I hope you answered no. A virus is not considered to be a living thing. And the reason is a throwback to one of our very first slides, is a biologist will consider something to be alive only if it displays all of the properties that we just talked about. The properties of being made of cells. Well, from the previous slide, viruses are not made of cells. They are acellular, or without a cell structure. They don't have any recognized cell parts. They're unusual little critters because while they do reproduce, they can't do it on their own. Living things begat other living things. Even if they require a partner, they'll still be able to produce more of their own kind. Viruses instead, they don't so much need a partner. It's not a form of sexual reproduction. Instead, it's considered more of a form of hijacking. Viruses, they require a host, which is very different than requiring a partner for reproduction. So right off the bat, viruses totally violate the first two items on this list. So the answer is no, viruses are not a living thing, even though these little entities, which is probably the best thing that we can call them, they can cause us a lot of problems, and they can even create diseases, but they're not living things. So this is the end of our first lesson, the characteristics of living things. Check out the other lessons that cover Chapter 1.